Hi, in this video, we're going to do a demo walkthrough of how to set up a connection to a file source and then how to set up various sources to that connection depending on the different file types. So the first thing that we're going to do in our DataForge environment is open the Connections tab, and we're going to start creating a new connection. And in this example, we're going to hook up to the data lake for this specific environment. We'll give it a description. Connection direction, we're going to select source because we're going to ingest the files, not output files. Connection type, we'll select file. We're not going to use an agent in this case because we're just going to run everything on Databricks clusters to ingest the data into DataForge. But if we did have the files somewhere that those clusters did not have network connectivity to, we could always install an agent and use that to ingest the data. Storage technology, we're going to start with Amazon S3. We will go through an example of how to ingest files from Azure into your Amazon or AWS hosted environment for DataForge. But starting with S3, the first thing that we need to get is the file path. So if we switch over to our S3 bucket, we're currently looking at the data lake. I'll zoom in once or twice here. And then within the data lake, I created this inbox folder where all my files are located. So within this inbox folder, you can see that there's a number of different file types. However, we're going to start with the customer files here. So if I open this up, just to give you an example, you can see that there's 4 CSV files. But before we even dig into the files, I got a little sidetracked. We can grab the file path to this bucket. So what we're going to do is paste that in, and I'm actually going to take out the inbox. So we want to make the connection as wide as possible. So this connection could then be reused for effectively any folder within the data lake. And then for cloud credentials, in this example, we're going to stick with the instance profile that's already attached to the environment. And so it already has authentication to this bucket right here. So we'll save this connection. And then now that we've got our working connection, we can go to sources and we'll start creating a new source. And now we'll start digging into the customer files. So we'll give the name, same thing, customer files for a demo. If we scroll down, we're going to be batch processing for files. We'll switch the connection type to file. Use the connection drop down and select that connection we just created. And now in our file mask, what we're going to do is basically finish the directory path from the connection to the files that we want. So in this case, again, if we look at the objects, we're going from data lake to inbox to customer files to then our file. So you can either copy that out or we can just type it in. So we'll go inbox to customer files. And then in this first example, what I want to do is actually just grab the first file, so customer one. So we'll name that in the file mask. And then our file type in this case is going to be delimited for CSV. For data refresh, we're not going to worry about that in this video, but you certainly would want to take that into account depending on the types of data that exist within your files. To start out, we're going to keep this as a scheduled initiation. There is an option to use a watcher, and we'll cover that in this video as well. I'm going to clear out the schedule just while we're developing, and then I'm going to expand the ingestion parameters here so that we can kind of explore some of the common parameters that you might use with files. So the first one is going to be this delete file option, and what this really does is basically says once the file is ingested into DataForge, do you want DataForge to then also delete the original file from that location where it's constantly pulling from and looking at? And then the next one that we'll use here is this archive file option. And what this does is, so we already defined and said, hey, we want to delete that original file when this runs. This will actually also then move a copy of that original file into a folder or path where you want any archive files. So in this case, what I'm going to do is actually in the inbox, we're going to have one archive folder, and then I'll follow the same kind of structure that we have here. So for our archive folder, I'm just going to do inbox/archive, or excuse me, yeah, inbox/archive. And then for this one, it's going to be customer files. And then the last kind of common parameter here is going to be whether it's a single file or multi-part. So for CSV, it's going to be single file. So we're going to leave that, and then we'll save the settings here. And then we'll start a new data pull. So we can see that first file, that customer1.csv, was already ingested, and we can see it's currently working on the parse process. So that means it's past ingestion, and it's past all the file movements that would need to happen. So if we go back to S3 just for a minute, we can explore kind of what happened with that archive and the delete. So we can see if we click into our customer files, that original file no longer exists because it was ingested and then deleted. And then in addition, within our archive folder, now we have the customer files and that same original file as a copy in case we ever need it. So we'll go back and go back to our customer files. We can see that that file got processed correctly. Now the next thing you might ask is, okay, that's great. You ingested one specific file. What happens if we need to ingest multiple files at the same time, or we have multiple files with very similar names? What you can do is actually update your file mask, and you can use a wildcard in the file mask to then pick up any files at the same time that match this customer, star.csv naming pattern. So again, we'll save our source settings here, and we'll do a new pull. And so we can see that those files are starting to get picked up. So we've got 2, 3, and 4, and we won't wait here for those to finish processing, but that's how you would set up kind of a more productionalized version of this source, so that as new files came in with different naming patterns but very similar, or if you knew that there were going to be multiple files dumped at the same time and you wanted to ingest all those files together, you can use that wildcard in your file mask. So the next example that we're going to go through is for multi-part. So we looked at that setting and the parameters that said single file. This next one, we're going to actually do a parquet file. So we'll go back to our S3 folders here. And then in this example, we have this line item folder. And within this folder, there are a number of different parquet files. And they're multi-part that should all be joined together, basically. So what we're going to do is go back and we'll start creating a new source again. And we'll give it a really spectacular name of parquet and description of demo. And again, we're going to leave batch processing. We'll switch it to file. We'll use that same connection. And then in this case, what we're going to do, rather than specifying down to an actual file part, we're actually going to stop at the folder level. So it's going to be inbox and line item. And then what we want to do is switch our file type to parquet. And schedule, I'm going to clear again. And then we're going to open our ingestion settings. And this time I don't want to delete, I don't want to archive. I'm just going to leave those files as is. Just going to import or ingest them one time. And then we're going to switch the source file type to multi-part so that it reads it correctly and looks for the directory rather than the individual files. So we'll save this and then kick off a new data pull. And these are much bigger files, so it'll take a little bit longer to run, but you can see that that ingestion is already completed. So we know that our source setup is good. And now it's just going to keep working through the standard processing types. We can see the file name is actually that directory where we're grabbing the multi-part files from. So that's how you'd set up Parquet with multi-part files in the parameters. Now the next thing that we're going to do is actually show an example of how to use the watcher. And the idea with the watcher is that it's constantly going to be looking at a specific directory and looking for a specific file mask. And as soon as there's a file dropped into that directory with matching that file mask, we're going to pick it up into DataForge. So rather than waiting for a scheduled pull, it's effectively going to pick up files as they're dropped into a folder. Now the difference with this is we actually need to change our connection. So if we go to our connections, we're actually going to create a new connection. And we'll use most of the same settings. I'll call it mostly the same name, data lake. This time I'm going to add access keys. And we'll give it a description. We'll use the same settings here, source and file, no agent, selecting from S3. And then the difference in this connection is that for the cloud credentials, for the file watcher setting, we cannot use that implicit instance profile. We do need to provide IAM access keys for this to work. So we're going to select that setting. And then we're going to grab the file path again. So if I copy this out, it's going to be the same as the previous connection. And then what we need to do is actually populate these parameters with that access key from AWS IAM. And if you're not familiar with this within AWS and IAM, you're going to have a user that has explicit policies or permissions to access each bucket. So it can get objects, get files, update files, etc. And then within the security credentials, you're going to create an access key. And we're going to use the access key and the key value for our connection, which I already have created. So I'm just going to copy these over. And then the next thing that we need is the AWS region. And so if we go back to our bucket, we're actually working in US West 2. So we're going to use that as our setting here. And then we'll save this. All right, so now that we've got another working connection with our access keys, now we can go back to that customer file source and we'll go to our settings tab. And what we're going to do is swap out the connection. So we're going to swap it for this access keys connection, and then we'll change the initiation type to watcher. And then we're just going to save the settings here. And so now our source is basically watching that file path and looking specifically for that file mask. So as soon as the new file is dropped, we're going to see that get picked up. So if we go back to S3 and we're in our customer files folder here, we're going to upload a new upload a new file. I'll just use customer 5 as the example here. So we can see that that file gets uploaded. And then if we go back to our source and we give it a little bit, we should see that file actually get picked up, and we did. So customer 5 is now getting brought in. And then we still have those same retention setting, those same parameter settings for deleting the file and moving a copy to the archive folder. So that's how you would use a watcher setting on your sources to actually just watch for when files are dropped rather than having a scheduled run of the files. Now the next thing that I want to show you is we've been working in AWS S3 this whole time. What we're going to do is actually set up a new connection to Azure. And so we'll pull in a file from Azure. And if I look at my Azure environment, I have a storage account, DF Quick Start Data Lake. And then within this, I have a container, and then I have a customer 6 file. So what we're going to do is go back to DataForge. We'll create a new connection, and that's going to point at Azure instead of AWS. So we'll just call it Azure Demo Files for demo. Again, we're going to do source and file. We'll do no. And then for storage technology, this time we're going to do Azure Data Lake Gen 2. And you can see that we have a number of different parameters that we need to populate here. So we'll go back to Azure and we can actually grab these. So the first thing is the storage account name. So we're going to grab this, copy it, and paste it. And then the next thing is this access key. And so within the storage account, you're going to see an area for access keys. And we're going to grab this key here. And we'll paste it in. And then the last thing that we need to do is actually specify the container within the storage account. And so that's going to be this df quick start -data lake. And this is basically an identical setup to anyone working within an Azure-based environment. Similarly, you would have these same settings that you would set up to connect to any files that you need. So now we've got our working connection to Azure, so we'll save this. And now we can go back and we can actually start creating actually, instead of creating a new source, we'll just use that same customer files. And so we go to settings, and I'm going to switch it back to schedule in this case because we don't want it to be a watcher. And then we will switch it. So I'll save that first, and then we'll switch the connection to that new Azure demo files. And what we're going to be looking for here is customer6.csv. So I'm just going to update my file mask, and we'll just specify it in this case. So we save that. Now we can do a new data pull, and we should see that that file actually gets brought over. Very cool. And so now that the file is actually getting brought in and ingested, one specific note on the connection. So if you're pulling from Azure into an AWS environment, you're not necessarily going to have immediate network connectivity. So for example, in your storage account. If your networking is set to be open, it's set to public, you can just immediately start pulling files. If it's not, then what you actually need to do is you need to go back into your AWS environment and you need to look up the NAT gateway that is used for Databricks. And you're going to grab the primary public IP address and you're going to go into Azure and you're going to add that as an IP address in your networking tab. And so that'll just give permission for the Databricks cluster running in AWS to actually access this container and this storage account. So that's how you can set up a connection and a source to pull data or files from Azure into AWS, and then vice versa. If you're working in an Azure environment, you need to pull files from AWS into Azure. Your connection is going to look identical to this setup here, where you're basically just going to provide it with the right IAM access keys, and then your connection will work, and you'll be able to pull in files. Now, the last few file types that I want to go through in this video, just to cover so that you're familiar with them. There's going to be a few different file types, and if we look at our data lake one more time, we can actually see those files in here. So the first one being this .prn file, this item values, and this is just an example of a fixed width file. So if we were to open that up and go to settings, although fixed width isn't super common, this is how you would actually set it up. So again, we have that connection to those files, and then we have the file mask that we're looking for. And then you're going to use the file type drop down to fixed width. You're going to identify the total line length of each record. And then you're going to actually specify the schema of the data that's coming in. And then within your parsing settings, you can actually identify things such as the line terminator, any rows to skip if you want to trim data, trim headers, etc. And so this is how you would set up a fixed width file. Now, more commonly, you might run into other file types such as JSON, Avro, etc. So if we take a look at, let's say, the Avro file first, we go to settings. Again, very similar setup with all your settings in here. The only real difference here is in your file type, you can select Avro, and your file mask you put in. And then similarly here, right, you can do single file, multi-part. It's really up to you and kind of what your files dictate. Now the second to last option that we want to cover here is JSON. So if we open this up and we go to settings, again, you're going to follow the same pattern as every other file type. You're going to put in the file mask. You're going to select the file type as JSON. And then again, in your parsing, you certainly have a lot of different options to work with on how you want to treat those files. And that's something I didn't really talk through a ton in the earlier examples. All these different file types are going to have different parameters that you can use. And for files specifically, they go through a parse process so that we can parse the schema and parse the data from that file type into a standard file format. So again, just know that parsing is going to be really where you're going to identify really all the options you need on how to handle each specific file that you have. So that's going to be JSON. And then the last one I just wanted to talk about quickly is we are very soon coming out with native support for XML files. However, as an example, if you had a different file type that DataForge did not support directly, what you could do is set up your source as basically, again, same settings, but for the file type, you're going to use other. And how this works then is we will be able to ingest the file regardless of the actual file type. But then because we don't have a native parser for that file, you'll actually use a custom parse notebook and a custom parse process to dictate exactly how you want to parse that file into a data frame and then load it back into a DataForge. And we do have a full other training on this available as well for you to look at. So those are how you'd work with the different file types and set up a connection to both AWS and Azure and pull in files using the different settings such as the schedule, the watcher, and then as well all the different parsing parameters that you can use for your different files that you're bringing in. So hopefully this helps. Thanks.